In the frozen dawn of February 1943, the rumble of distant thunder rolled across the Polish countryside. But this was no storm. It was steel, a 400-ton monster crawling along the rails, pulling the pride of Nazi Germany behind it. Adolf Hitler's Schwerer Gustav, the largest artillery cannon ever built, moved across occupied Europe like a moving fortress. It was a symbol of unstoppable power, a gun so vast it could fire a 7-ton shell over 25 miles, crushing fortresses that no air raid could touch. The Germans called it a miracle of engineering. The Allies called it a nightmare on tracks. But as this behemoth rolled through Poland toward the Eastern Front, a silent figure watched from behind a railway embankment. A man in a soot-stained uniform, his hands black with grease, his eyes following every bolt, every coupling, every section of track. His name was Jan Nowak, a 32-year-old Polish rail worker. To the Germans, he was invisible, another slave laborer maintaining their supply lines. But to the Polish resistance, he was something far more dangerous, a man who understood the veins of the Reich. Every train that passed, every wheel that turned, every bridge that shook, Jan knew it better than anyone else. The railway was his language. That morning, as Gustav's massive wheels crushed the rails beneath, Jan wasn't just repairing track. He was memorizing, counting, calculating. Because in the midst of the most powerful war machine the world had ever seen, one man with a wrench was about to rewrite the meaning of sabotage. The Germans had begun transporting the Gustav cannon east after its terrifying debut in the siege of Sevastopol. Its 80-centimeter shells had shattered coastal fortifications that the Soviets once called indestructible. But after that campaign, the gun's purpose changed. Hitler wanted it redeployed to prepare for Operation Citadel, the planned assault on Kursk, which would become the largest tank battle in human history. The only problem, moving it. The gun was so enormous it required 2 parallel railway tracks to support its weight. Bridges had to be reinforced. Curves had to be redrawn. Villages were bulldozed just to make room for its passage. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a moving empire of logistics. And along this empire, Hitler's engineers relied on one thing: the obedience of the rail workers forced to maintain it. Jan Nowak had been assigned to the Debica railway sector, a crucial junction between Krakow and the industrial arteries leading eastward. The Germans thought of him as a harmless mechanic, someone who could repair broken bolts and reset switches. But Jan was secretly part of the Armia Krajowa, the Polish Home Army. And through his quiet work on the railway, he was watching, listening, and feeding information to the underground. When word reached his sector that the Gustav train would pass through, he knew it wasn't just another shipment. It was a once-in-a-war opportunity. The Germans took every precaution. Military police patrolled the tracks day and night. Every rail joint was inspected twice. Local workers were searched at gunpoint before every shift. But they overlooked one thing. The system depended on trust and familiarity. Jan had built that trust over years of silence. He had fixed the German officers' motor cars, helped clear wrecks after partisan attacks, and never once refused an order. The soldiers even nicknamed him Schweigsamer Pole, the silent Pole. And that silence was his shield. When the Gustav gun slid from its rails, the ground itself seemed to exhale. For the villagers who had watched in silence, it was like seeing a god fall. For the German command, it was a humiliation wrapped in disbelief. They called it a mechanical anomaly, an accident, a freak failure of engineering. But deep within the files of the Polish Home Army, the truth was preserved in ink and blood. It wasn't an accident. It was the result of one man's perfect act of precision sabotage. The Germans cordoned off the entire area within hours. Engineers in gray overcoats arrived by truck, pacing the wreckage like surgeons over a wounded giant. The Gustav's front bogie lay twisted, 2 of its axles bent, and the rails beneath it splintered like matchsticks. It had taken 2 years to build the weapon, and just a handful of bolts to bring it to its knees. In Berlin, when reports reached Hitler's headquarters, disbelief turned to fury. He demanded to know who was responsible. Every name on the maintenance logs was checked. Dozens of Polish workers were rounded up. Some were executed. Others were sent to camps. But Jan Nowak's name never appeared. He had vanished before the German patrols arrived, slipping into a network of forest trails that wound through southern Poland toward the Tatra Mountains. With him traveled a small leather pouch containing two things: a railway schedule and a hand-drawn map of the Gustav's route. Jan knew the Germans would rebuild the gun. They had to. It was a symbol as much as a weapon. And so he carried his knowledge not as pride, but as burden, because now the Gestapo would be searching for him. For weeks, he moved at night and hid by day, guided by resistance contact who risked their lives to move him from village to village. He slept in barns, drank from streams, and kept the smell of oil on his hands. It made him feel human, like the man he had been before the war turned his tools into weapons. In April 1943, he reached Krakow, where the Home Army Command had established one of its most secret networks, Związek Kolcharski, the railway union. It was a resistance branch formed entirely of railway workers. These men and women didn't carry rifles. Their weapons were time, steel, and knowledge. They changed schedules to misdirect German transports. They replaced switches to send ammunition trains into dead ends. They cut telegraph lines and forged maintenance orders that confused entire sectors. And now, they had a legend among them, the man who stopped Gustav. When Jan arrived, he was thin, quiet, his eyes shadowed from weeks on the run. The commander, Captain Roman Debski, greeted him with a firm handshake. "We heard rumors," Debski said softly, "that the giant fell, that you did it." Jan looked down at his hands. "It wasn't just me," he said. "It was the rail." Debski smiled. "Then the rail has a soul." For the next months, Jan trained others in his methods. How to identify weak points in rails, how to sabotage without detection, how to mimic where patterns so German inspectors wouldn't notice. His attention to detail was legendary. He once told a young worker, "Explosives make noise. Steel makes silence." The Germans fear silence more. By mid-1943, his techniques had spread across the Polish underground. Trains carrying ammunition to the Eastern Front began disappearing, derailing, or arriving days late. German logistics officers blamed partisans in the forests, never realizing that most of the damage came from within the rails themselves. It was the birth of what historians would later call the Silent Front, an invisible war waged not with bullets, but with bolts. Meanwhile, the Germans began the painstaking process of reconstructing the Gustav gun. It was repaired, reassembled, and moved to the Bavarian city of Grafenwöhr, where it remained for testing and refitting. But it never regained its former glory. The derailment had bent its alignment just enough that it could no longer achieve perfect accuracy. Its next missions were canceled, its shells stored away. By the time the Allies invaded Normandy in 1944, the gun, once the pride of Nazi artillery, sat idle, hidden, and useless. In the shadows of history, one anonymous act of sabotage had quietly erased one of Hitler's mightiest weapons from the battlefield. In Krakow, Jan's network continued to grow. His knowledge of rail design made him invaluable not just to Poland, but to the British intelligence service, which had begun coordinating with the Home Army. Through coded radio transmissions, reports of rail movements, weapon transports, and German troop logistics were sent to London. The information was so precise that by 1944, British analysts were using Polish railway maps to predict German defenses in France and the East. Jan never saw himself as a hero. He refused medals, refused promotion. He simply repaired, planned, and moved in silence. When asked once why he kept fighting when others fled, he replied, "Because steel remembers who built it. I'd rather it remember me than them." Then came 1944, the year of uprising. The Warsaw Uprising called thousands of Poles into open revolt. The railways became lifelines for both resistance and German reinforcements. The Germans turned the tracks into killing zones, bombing lines, burning bridges, shooting any civilian caught within a mile of the rails. Still, Jan continued his work, often alone, crawling under freight cars, loosening couplings, and switching signals to cause chaos. Every act delayed a train, saved a platoon, or stole hours from the Reich's war machine. But the price was catching up to him. In December 1944, near Rzeszów, German security forces ambushed a resistance cell. Documents captured from the group mention a man known only as the Mechanic. The Gestapo issued an order for his capture. On a bitter January night in 1945, as Soviet artillery rumbled on the horizon, Jan received orders to dismantle a bridge the Germans planned to use for retreat. He led a small team under the cover of darkness, carrying charges disguised in toolboxes. As they worked, headlights appeared on the far side of the bridge. A German patrol, sooner than expected. Jan told the others to flee through the river. He stayed behind, cutting the final cable. When the first truck reached the bridge, the weakened structure gave way. The wooden planks cracked, collapsing into the frozen water below. The explosion that followed, small, controlled, deliberate, lit the night with brief fire. The next morning, the resistance found no trace of January. Only his wrench, frozen to the steel girder. Some said he drowned. Others said he escaped into the Carpathian forests and joined Soviet engineers repairing captured railways. No one ever found his body. When the war ended, the Gustav gun was discovered by Allied troops near Metten, Germany. The Germans had tried to destroy it before capture, but its remains still stood, colossal, rusting, silent. American soldiers posed for photographs beside its massive barrel, unaware that this weapon, once meant to destroy cities, had been undone by a single man with a file and a wrench. The official records made no mention of Jan Nowak. To the world, the Gustav simply fell out of service due to maintenance issues. But in Poland, in whispered stories passed through generations of railway workers, the legend endured. They spoke of the man who never raised a rifle, yet crippled the Reich's greatest gun. They said that even years after the war, whenever a train derailed near Tarnow, old men would nod and murmur, "Jan is still at work." Decades later, historians began piecing together fragments from declassified Polish resistance archives. Among them, a faded report dated March 1943, stamped with the insignia of the Home Army. It read, Operation Iron Vein. Objective: halt enemy supergun transport. Status: success. Casualties: minimal. Notes: Subject Nowak achieved result through rail failure engineering. Impact: enemy weapon disabled for 6 months. Psychological effect on German command severe. It was the first and only surviving record linking Jan Nowak to the Gustav incident. In the years after the war, the world celebrated generals, tank commanders, and fighter aces. But few remembered the silent hands that shaped the unseen war. The men and women who fought not in trenches, but in shadows, under bridges and along the rails. Jan Nowak's story remained buried, not because it was forgotten, but because it was quiet. And perhaps that was fitting. His war had never been about glory. It was about control, about proving that even a world ruled by machines, human will could still bend steel. Emotional ending. In the cold dawn of a modern Europe, freight trains still roll through the same Polish valleys, their wheels singing across the steel veins laid by men long gone. Somewhere beneath those tracks, rusted fragments of the Gustav line still sleep. Remnants of a weapon that once symbolized fear. No monuments bear Jan Nowak's name. No medals were ever pinned to his chest. But every time a train passes safely through the curve near Tarnow, it runs over the same earth where tyranny once stumbled. And maybe that's the truest kind of victory. Not the one written in parades or history books, but the one whispered through the rails, where a single worker proved that the smallest act of defiance could derail an empire.